Thank you so much for joining us. This is Can the United States Be United? And before you respond immediately with no, please take the time to listen to the conversation we're about to have. We're going to have about 40 minutes of conversation and then time for about 10 minutes of questions. There will be 2 people with microphones who will be handling our Q&A. I will remind you now, I will remind you then. Questions, not comments. Questions, with a question mark at the end. So I'm Jane Costen. I'm a New York Times writer and host of the New York Times podcast, The Argument, which actually makes this the perfect venue for me because these are 2 people who I'm hoping are going to have a spirited and very civil agreement or disagreement about what the diverse and in many ways polarized United States can do to prevent further fracture, or if that's possible, and what all of that means. So I'm actually going to first ask our panelists to explain who they are. So Barbara, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Barbara Walter. It's great to be here. I'm a political scientist. I've spent 30 years studying civil war, domestic terrorism, violent extremism. I usually do that in a small room behind a computer screen. I had a book come out in January where I basically took all the amazing knowledge that we've accrued in academia, plus the knowledge that a task force that I served on that was run by the CIA has accrued about what the risk factors are for civil war, and I applied it to the United States.
And Yascha, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Yascha Mounk. I'm a political scientist. I teach at Johns Hopkins, and I'm a writer at The Atlantic. I really started working on the threat that authoritarian populism poses to democracy back when I would go into rooms like this one or go into academic rooms and say, there might be a threat to American democracy, and people looked at me and thought I was crazy. So I'm a democracy crisis hipster. I thought that democracy was in crisis before it was cool. I've also started, and perhaps that'll be a beginning of our conversation, to worry a little bit over the last years that the conventional wisdom has completely flipped. It's flipped from American democracy is safe forever to we're already screwed and there's nothing we can do. And I think that pessimism can actually be very dangerous as well.
Well, we're having this conversation in the wake of 2 massive moments for our country's politics and for our country. First, the January 6th hearings, which I think for many people are one of the first ways in which we get to understand at the macro and the micro level what led to January 6th, 2021. And I think for many people also that was their first inkling of the idea that the American system, fragile as it has seemed, could be truly threatened, especially by the people who were supposed to protect it. And this is also coming just days after the Supreme Court ruled to overturn Roe versus Wade and purportedly return the issue of abortion back to the states, which I think for many people, again, is a massive shock to the system, both politically and culturally. So Barbara, can you tell me, historically, what do big political shocks do to countries, whether they have a federalist system like ours or whether they have a more direct democracy?
Well, it all depends on how strong the political system is, and by that I mean how strong the institutions are. If you go back and you read the Federalist Papers, if you read what Hamilton wrote and what Madison wrote, they were really, really concerned about the United States becoming a kingdom. They didn't want that to happen. And they actually were social psychologists in some ways. They understood that we are human beings, and human beings are not perfect. And in any population, there are going to be individuals who want to grab power and who want to become kings. And so they understood that they couldn't create a system that kind of hoped that they would get George Washington's ad infinitum. They had to create a system that was designed to handle people who would come to power and try to destroy the system. And so the key was to create really, really strong institutions, lots of checks and balances, lots of ways to make it really difficult for an individual in the executive branch to grab power. And if you do that, and a crisis happens, the country can weather that storm. But if you have a country with weak institutions, whose democracy is, you could argue, in decline, or where there are vulnerabilities in that system, and there's uncertainty about whether the system will hold or not, or if in fact the country will divide into two and turn on itself, then crises can be a catalyzing force for those very individuals who would like to use that crisis to consolidate power.
Yascha, in your book, The Great Experiment, Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure, you talk a lot about what can divide democracies, talk about race, religion, ethnicity. But I'm curious, now I think we're experiencing something which is the division on specific issues, which is not new. If we think back to an issue so salient as slavery, it was not necessarily race or religion that divided this country for the Civil War. It was the issue, the practice of slavery. So looking at what our country is doing now, how do issues divide democracies, and how do divisive ideas, such as they exist, how does that change a democracy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think a lot of these issues, of course, are about the standing of different groups, right? I mean, you can frame slavery as being about an issue, as it was, but obviously also was in a fundamental way about the lack of equal standing in the most extreme way for one part of the population. And so what I try to do in this book, in The Great Experiment, is to show that actually what we're trying to do today in the United States, but in many democracies around the world, doesn't have much historical precedent, which is to build these ethnically and religiously diverse democracies that actually treat their members as equals. And that's really difficult for a few fundamental psychological reasons. One of them is that humans, going back to social psychology, are just groupish by nature, right? They tend to form groups very easily. They're often capable of great courage and altruism in how they treat members of their own group, but they can also very easily discriminate against anybody who they think of as a member of a different group, right? And we've seen, that's the second reason historically, that these things can be silly stuff, right? When I teach my undergrads, I ask them whether or not a hot dog is a sandwich. I haven't debated that question for 5 or 10 minutes. If we had more time, I would do that to you. I'm going to have them play games against each other. And those who think that a hot dog is a sandwich start to discriminate against those who think that a hot dog is not a sandwich, right? So it can be over silly things, but a lot of the time historically it's been over the things that Jane mentioned, over race, over religion, over culture, language, nationality. That's what explains some of the biggest crimes of human history, some of the worst wars and civil wars, and forms of ethnic cleansing and genocide and so on. So I do think that often what actually tears society apart is that kind of group. And then when it comes to issues, it seems to me that it's actually, those often become totems of different groups, right? Even if you think of something like abortion, actually there's a majority for a set of laws which essentially are on the books in Europe, which basically mean free access to abortion in the first trimester and then significant restrictions after the first trimester. That is the law on the land in virtually every European country. That is where a majority of the American population is. But we can't get to that solution because of the way that America has fallen into different tribes. And the most important tribes today are actually partisan tribes. So we tend to think of our country as divided among religions and ethnicities in particular, races in particular. And I do worry about their potential to tear us apart. But I'm actually quite optimistic about how we're doing on that front. I'm more pessimistic about how we're doing at managing the partisan war between Democrats and Republicans.
Barbara, I'm curious, when issues change in salience or when groups shift, for instance, when you go back to the original Roe versus Wade decision, that was a 7-2 decision. You know, the issue of abortion has grown in salience and grown in polarization. You know, I always think about, you were mentioning European abortion laws, and I keep thinking, I wrote about this in the Times, but if you told people who are strongly anti-abortion, like, congratulations, you now have France's abortion laws, I don't think they'd be like, yay. So I'm curious, from your perspective, when issues change in salience or when groups shift. You've done a lot of work on white nationalism on the far right, but what we're seeing is that white nationalist groups still exist and are continuing to become more extreme, but now there are groups where they are purportedly multiracial, but they adhere to, kind of patriarchal, misogynistic tropes in which being male is more important than being white in some ways. So how do those shifts take place, and what does that mean?
Yeah. So let me take a step back and say, I actually don't think we're more divided by issues today than we have been in the past. We have been polarized, politically polarized here in the United States before. Think about the 1960s. But if you look at the parties back then, the Republicans and the Democrats, the issues what divided them were social and economic issues, whether you believed in higher taxes or lower taxes, a bigger social safety net, whether you, a whole host of those issues. What divides the parties today, and which is new and unique, is that they have, as Yascha said, become divided by race and religion. And so when you talk about the Roe v. Wade, and is this a shift in issues? Yes and no. What it is the rise of fundamentalist Christians, evangelical Christians, who are now disproportionately powerful in politics and are increasingly able to push their minority position on a majority of Americans. And why have evangelicals become disproportionately powerful? It's because of the way that our electoral system is designed. And so when I think about American politics today, and I think about the biggest problem that we have, it is that we are factionalized by religion and by race. So if you look even as far back as 2008, white Americans were almost equally divided between the Republican and the Democratic Party. If you look back a little bit further, you could see that also religions sort of were equally likely, different religions were equally likely to be part of both parties. That has radically changed to the point where the Republican Party today is 80% white, overwhelmingly Christian, and if you look at the Democratic Party, about 90% of African Americans vote for the Democrats, majority of Latinos, Asians vote for the Democrats, and if you're atheist, Muslim, you also are much more likely to vote for the Democrats. So we've seen this split along tribal and religious lines, and if one party really believes that if you have lots of true believers, as you do in the pro-life movement, and they get a majority on the Supreme Court, they're going to push through their social issues. I don't think it's been a shift in their beliefs or a shift amongst Americans regarding this issue. It's just been that particular subset of Americans has gained power.
So Jane was very keen for us to disagree, and I think this is a moment where perhaps we disagree a little bit. Because I think that that's an overly simplistic description of what the division in American society is like today. So there's this brand narrative of American, it's amazing that at the moment, liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans can't agree on anything, right? Except one set of really ambitious projections about what the country would look like in 30 or 40 or 50 years, which Democrats tend to embrace and Republicans tend to fear, but both think it's going to happen. And that's broadly speaking that there's demographic change, which is going to mean that America becomes majority-minority by about 2045, as the United States Census Bureau projects, and that there's this rising democratic majority, that as white voters decline as a share of the population and non-white voters increase as a share of the population, Democrats are going to find it easier and easier to win election because the demography is really what's driving this political division. I just think the evidence for that isn't there. So first of all, when you look at Irish Americans, they were one of the most consistent voter groups for Democrats in the 1960s. Now they're one of the most consistent voter groups for Republicans. When you look at the 2020 election, why was Donald Trump competitive? Because he significantly increased his share of the vote among every non-white demographic, among African Americans and Asian Americans and especially Hispanics. Why did Joe Biden win? Because he significantly increased his share of the vote among white voters relative to Hillary Clinton in 2016. We've had polls in recent weeks in which Hispanics in the majority support the Republican, not the Democratic Party. We've had a special election 10 days ago in a district in southern Texas that's 85% Hispanic, where they voted for Republicans. So actually, I think that our society is much less obviously divided politically along those kind of racial lines than we like to think, and it seems to be depolarizing by race, actually. But the division doesn't become less deep and less nasty because of that. The hatred between Democrats and Republicans doesn't become less because of that. The mistrust doesn't become less than that. I worry, as a Democrat, that Republicans try to steal the election in 2020, and are going to try in a really dangerous way to steal the election in 2024. But you know what? People who are strong Republicans think that we stole the election in 2020, and that we might try to steal the election in 2024. But those are both multiracial coalitions, right? The two of us are both white. I think the two of us both vote for the Democratic Party, right? So I think actually it really is that political division that is deepest in our country right now.
I think this will be for another panel, but there are two things that I find interesting here. And then I want to ask Barbara a question that I'm sure you're asked all the time. One is that the number of people who are self-identified evangelicals who do not go to church has risen dramatically. So even what it means to be or interpret yourself as being a Christian, if you go to the polling data as to basic Christian belief system, like, do you believe Jesus Christ is the Savior? Do you believe that he rose from the dead after 3 days? Like, there are an increasing number of people who consider themselves to be evangelical who would say no to those questions. I also think that it is occasionally complicated when we're talking about non-white voters, which is actually one of my least favorite things, because it does this thing where it's just like all non-white people all hang out in one big room.
Right.
And sometimes, so it's like when people say the black community, and that always implies that we have a Zoom meeting. It's just like me, LeBron, we're gonna hash it out. But I think that like when you're looking at the voting patterns.
May I say, the word community is so weird in America. Barack Obama always used to talk about the terrorist community. This is such an odd locution.
From what we've learned about certain terrorist organizations, sometimes they talk a lot on the phone. And then they talk to the FBI, and then the FBI is like, oh, we'll help you with your terrorism, and then they don't. But I'm always struck by how Latino voting patterns and African-American voting patterns, African-Americans are generally very social conservative, but African-Americans continue to vote for Democrats. But I think what I want to get to is actually the subject, Barbara, of your book. Which is talking about the idea of civil war. And I think for many people in America, we have two conceits of what civil war means. One is the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865, in which the good guys won and the participation trophy holders lost. And then we have examples of civil war from other countries in which you think about long-running, decades-long conflicts over ethnic issues, over religious issues that kill thousands of people and are often not settled for years. So when you're talking about the threat of a civil war in the United States, can you tell me, what do you mean by a civil war? What defines a civil war?
Yeah. So it is not the 1860s version of a civil war. That is the old-time version of a civil war. The 21st century type of civil war is very, very different. And the way to think about it is more as an insurgency. And in fact, the CIA has a manual. You could Google it and you can find it. And they put out the manual as a way for the US government to identify insurgencies as they were arising. And if you read that, what will strike you is that of the three stages, we probably are at the second stage. This is certainly not what was happening in the 1860s, but it's what we see happening around the world today is these very decentralized types of conflict. They're fought by militias, by guerrilla organizations. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they don't work together. They never engage the military. If you were a group that wanted to, let's say, gain territory here, or if you wanted to intimidate a particular population and convince them to leave a state, you were going to avoid the US military at all costs because that's a losing strategy. So instead, you pursue unconventional tactics, terrorism, that's directed at opposition leaders or members of minorities or judges who are ruling against your particular preferred policies. Or you engage in guerrilla warfare. You put a bomb in a train station, or you have a sniper firing from the top of a roof. That's the type of conflict we're likely to see. Can I take a few more minutes?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. This is something you've written a lot about, and I think a lot of people are interested in what this means.
Yes. So I think the most helpful thing I can do for this room today is to give you a framework for understanding what's happening in the country today from the perspective of somebody who studies violence. So again, as I said, our own government has a task force. It's called the Political Instability Task Force. It's been around since 1994. It's run through the CIA, and I was asked to serve on that task force in 2017. The goal of the task force, which was a mix of experts on political violence and civil war and data analysts, our job was to come up with a model that would help the US government predict where around the world governments were likely to experience political violence and possibly civil war. So 4 times a year, we would sit in a conference room in suburban Virginia. We would relay the scholarship that really smart people at universities around the world were doing. We would tell them what were those factors that seemed to put countries at a higher risk, and the data analysts would work their models until they came up with the most parsimonious one. We gave them 38 different factors, and it included things that we thought might matter, whether a country was poor, whether there was high levels of income inequality, whether there was high levels of ethnic and religious diversity, whether a country was really big or really small. We gave them all these factors, and it turns out that only 2 of those factors were highly predictive, and it was not the ones that we expected, we the experts expected. The first was something that we call Inocracy. Inocracy is just a fancy term for partial democracy. It's democracies whose institutions were weak. And they were either weak because this was a new democracy that was being formed, or they were weak because it was an established democracy that was in decline. It turns out you don't get political violence and civil war on either extreme. The most democratic countries, the Denmarks, the Switzerlands, the Canadas, almost never experience civil war. The full autocracies, the North Koreas, the Saudi Arabias, they also actually rarely experience civil wars. The civil wars happen in the middle. So that's the first factor. The second factor is this thing we called ethnic factionalism, and that is when political parties are more concerned about attracting people based on their race, their religion, or their ethnicity than based on particular ideas, particular policies. Okay, so if a country had these 2 features, the task force, we put them on something we called the watch list. That was what it was called, and we handed the watch list to the White House. I don't know what the White House did with it. I assume they watched. And these countries were considered at high risk of civil war. So to anticipate your question, like what does high risk of civil war mean? It doesn't mean that we're on the precipice of war. We knew that countries that had these 2 features had about a 4% annual risk of civil war. That seems like it's small, but it's not. It means that every year that those 2 factors continue to exist, every year that a country's government is in this middle zone, and its politics are heavily driven by identity as opposed to ideology, that risk increases. So after 10 years, the risk is 40%. It's very similar to your risks of dying of a smoking-related disease if you start smoking. If I started smoking this year, my chances of dying of lung cancer are very, very small. If I continue to smoke every year, by 30, 40, 50 years from now, probably the way I'm going to die is related to how much I smoked. So it's similar. And so again, I was sitting in Washington, in suburban Virginia. I know that we know what the 2 factors are that put countries on the road to political violence, but the CIA is legally not allowed to talk about the United States. We never mentioned the United States. We never studied the United States. We could only look at countries outside of America. And so, it's 2017. And I know the measures we're using, and I could see that the measures that the US's measure of democracy was declining. It declined in 2016 for the first time. It declined again in 2019. And by December of 2020, the United States, by the measure that the US government uses, was in this middle zone for the first time since 1800. And then again, if you looked at the definition that we used for what made a country's politics ethnically factionalized, by December of 2020, it met our measures. So if we had been able to study the United States, we would have put the United States on the watch list in December of 2020. Now, since then, our democracy has actually improved in terms of its rating, and it improved because we had a peaceful transfer of power. It did not improve because our institutions were strengthened. So we are still vulnerable to backsliding. I'm sorry. That was a very long-winded response, but I think it was important to put it in context.
Well, Yascha, I'm curious because we were talking a little bit about how you think about civil war, but your entire book is about, in some senses, stopping that kind of ethnic and religious factionalism and learning from other diverse democracies, whether for good or for ill, how to have this not happen? So I'm curious as to your thoughts.
Yes, let me lay out a few thoughts. First of all, I think in political science we think that we can just define terms as we want. And I think that's right? There's no God-given definition of civil war, right? There's not one objective definition of civil war. The way we think about this is that we want to have a clear definition that people understand in a particular context and that's useful in a particular context. But I do think it's concerning to use a concept of civil war that is so broad that people think, oh my God, we're going to go back to the American Civil War. We're going to see what we had in Syria. But what we're actually talking about is a very serious thing, a few hundred deaths through political violence over the course of a year, various clashes and protests and so on, but very, very different from that, right? By the definition
still
of
bad. Still very bad.
But not what it sounds like we're talking about, right? So by the definition of civil war we just heard, Germany, Italy, France, the United Kingdom were probably all in civil war in the 1970s because of significant political violence and some political terrorist movements, right? We don't think of those countries as having had civil wars in those decades because even though there was very worrying political violence, but we really should have been concerned about and were concerned about, and we really don't want America to get there, and perhaps America already is there, that is not what we think about when we think about civil war like in Syria or civil war like in our own past. So let me lay out the sort of set of possibilities that I think are going to happen. Because the best way of thinking about this is not what's going to happen. It's not a point estimate. It's a range of possibilities. And I'm going to start with something that's actually more alarmist than what Barbara says. I think there is a possibility of actual civil war in 2024. Here's how it would look. This is what keeps me up at night. There are attempts by states that are controlled by Republicans to overrule how we decide who to send to the Electoral College, so that the process becomes politicized, so that a governor and a parliament and a state and senate can decide, hey, Democrats won the popular vote in Arizona, but you know what? Actually, there was voter fraud. We've determined this, and so therefore we're sending a Republican slate of electors to the Electoral College. What happens next, we could talk about for 4 hours, is really complicated and nobody quite knows. Nobody knows whether the Supreme Court can step in or not. It is really damn complicated. And so we might get to a place where different officials in the United States reasonably determine a different answer as to whom they should serve. And that is a scenario for an actual civil war in which the different branches of the United States military may come to different conclusions as to who the commander-in-chief is. Now, the likelihood of that is very low. It's less than 1%. But it is way higher than you want it to be. That keeps me up at night. I think the second possibility, which I think in some ways we've already had in 2020, is many years of low-level political violence. Right? Many years where most of us go about our lives perfectly fine. Basically, if you don't go and seek out violence, if you don't go and seek out a protest, if you don't go and seek out the moments where people clash, you're probably going to be fine. But we do see a significant amount of political violence and perhaps some really terrible politically motivated terrorist attacks or political assassinations in the country. We've had that in certain ways in the 60s. We argue we had that in certain ways in 2020, and I think it's quite possible that we're going to have an intensified version of that in the next years. I think we also should look at the other end of the probability distribution. Not to be quietist, but because we actually need an optimistic understanding of what to aim for in order to avert some of those outcomes. I said at the beginning, when Jane asked me to introduce myself, that I've seen the conventional wisdom flip in this bizarre way, where 7 years ago, I was being looked at askance for saying, perhaps American democracy is not guaranteed. Perhaps it might be in trouble in the future. Now I'm looked at askance in many of the same rooms when I say, you know what, there are also optimistic scenarios in which actually we manage to depolarize. The moment passes as it did at the end of the 1960s, and a few years from now, we're not going to have political violence. We're going to have political parties that are better able to coexist and will have less polarization. Just one last point, because I think that one thing that I find striking about Barbara's work that I agree with has an implication that we really need to spell out. She was saying, what is one of the two fundamental risk factors is when political parties mobilize on the basis of identity and particularly of race. I am heartened by the fact, I don't want Donald Trump to get any votes, but I'm heartened by the fact that he increased his share of a vote among all of these different demographics. That is a positive development. And I'm struck by the fact that many of my friends and colleagues, some of whom are strategists for the Democratic Party, basically still hold on to this idea that our share of the population is growing, we're going to be able to outvote the Republicans, wait for them to die off, and then we'll rule this country, right? I think that is morally horrifying, because I don't want to live in a country where in 30, 40 years I can look into this audience and know who you're voting for by looking at the color of your skin. But it's also really, really dangerous. And so actually, it is a good development if Republicans generally tried to build a multiracial working class coalition, as some Republicans are trying to do. And Democrats desperately need to try to do what Barack Obama did in 2008. Rather than talking about how unfair the Senate is, we should go back and try and win some of those states, like Iowa and Indiana and so on, that Barack Obama was able to win in 2008, because that's the best contribution we can make to mitigating one of these risk factors.
Yeah. And I completely agree with that. So if you think about the framework and you think about, okay, what do we do to reduce the risk of civil war? Well, the first thing you do is strengthen our institutions, right? There's a whole series of really, really undemocratic features in our democracy that Denmark, Switzerland, and all these other healthy democracies don't have. Gerrymandering, the filibuster, the electoral college. There's all sorts of ways that we are vulnerable to backsliding. We know what they are. We can change that. And then the second way that you reduce the risk is to have our political parties begin to be more inclusive, to reach across racial and religious lines, and to begin to appeal to voters based on ideas, real policy positions, rather than these wedge issues that often tend to prey on people's prejudices. So I completely agree.
Sorry, Jane.
Hi.
We'll call this episode The Agreement. So a couple of things that I want everyone to be thinking about is that one thing I'm always struck by when we're talking about successful democracies is that you mentioned Denmark, Switzerland, other countries. A lot of those countries are largely ethnically and racially homogeneous. Yeah. And I think that one of the particular challenges that we face is actually a challenge faced by, say, a country like Brazil. Countries that are extremely racially and ethnically heterogeneous. Yeah. And I think that we face, and I think, an opportunity, but also a challenge because of that. Yeah. I would also say that one thing I am struck by is when you see, I, of course, am supportive of multiracial parties. But I also think it's interesting when those multiracial parties can unite around not issues of race, but those so-called wedge issues. If you can get a bunch of people of a bunch of different races to all agree that marriage equality is evil, I'm not sure how good I feel about that. Yeah. And so I think that this has been really informative for me, but I know that I definitely have a lot of questions that I'll be thinking about, and now this is an opportunity for you to ask these two brilliant people some questions. So we have amazing people with microphones. There's a microphone over here and a microphone over there. So if you want to be asked, if you want to ask a question, I will point to you, and then someone will come to you. So you here, and then you over here in the peplum. Is that a peplum shirt? Sure. Yeah, let's go with that.
It's on perfect.
Awesome.
Thank you, guys. I had a headache, and it went away listening to you. So I think we should vote that if we do, in fact, have a civil war, it should be held in the metasphere or whatever, metaverse. Because, but my question is more fundamental about democracy.
Yeah.
Do you all believe that democracy is one, static? And if it is not, would we not see this time as the evolution of democracy?
Oh, Barbara?
I would love to take that. So what's so amazing about the United States and our democracy is we started this grand experiment. We were the first modern democracy. We showed the world how you can create a democracy. We exported our democracy to lots of different countries, whether for good or ill. And we are now going to be the first democracy that's going to transition from a white majority, from being a white majority country to being a white minority country. We're going to be the first, but others are going to follow. Canada is going to come after us, followed by New Zealand, followed by Australia, followed by the UK, followed by the countries of Europe, probably by 2100. And so again, like, we have this opportunity. Well, we have to get this right, because the world is going to look to us to show them, how do you transition? How do you have democracy in an incredibly large, somewhat chaotic, very diverse, constantly changing country? How do you evolve your democracy so that it remains strong and that it remains representative? And you could be sure that Canada and New Zealand and all these other countries are going to watch us to see how we do it, and so that they can best transition as well.
Yes.
May I jump in on this as well? So that really is the topic of my last book, The Great Experiment, Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. And I would say two things about this. One, yes, democracies are always dynamic, societies are always dynamic. There's always changes at the level of culture, which then also force some amount of changes at the level of institutions. One of the difficulties in the United States is that the institutions of a country are genuinely brilliant, but they are very difficult to change. And that makes it hard often to keep pace with a changing society. I think some of the changes that we've made in the heart of our culture are actually very positive. And so we've talked a lot about the political polarization and the very real risk of political violence and other things. I think it's also worth pausing for a moment to recognize that when you look away from Washington, away from cable news, we have gone a long way towards building ethnically and religiously diverse democracy that actually tries to treat people as equals, much more than it did in the past. Right? It's easy to focus on the steps back on various forms of sexual and so on rights, for example. But let's not forget that in the 1990s, Ellen DeGeneres had to leave her talk show when she openly acknowledged being lesbian. Today, it is not a big deal for Pete Buttigieg to run for president, and we have marriage equality on the books. When it comes to the way we interact as citizens of this country, in 1960, 5% of Americans, 5%, thought that it was morally acceptable for white and black Americans to marry each other. Today, 5% think that it's not acceptable. And we see a real change in behavior in the rise of mixed-race Americans and so on. Both the right and actually parts of the mainstream and the left worry about the integration of immigrants. The right claims that immigrants coming in today somehow inferior to past immigrants, and that's why they're not succeeding. The left says they can't succeed because of the extent of discrimination and injustice they suffer, and they definitely do suffer real discrimination and injustice. But the best studies show that actually immigrants today from Mexico and El Salvador and Vietnam and Kenya and Nigeria rise socioeconomically and educationally at about the same speed as Irish and Italian immigrants did a century ago. And finally, just because Jane really hoped that we would have some disagreements, and I think by and large, Barbara and I do agree, I think it's really dangerous to say that the country is going to be majority-minority in the way the Census Bureau does and the way that Barbara just did. If you accept a racialist definition by which anybody who has one drop of non-white blood, not just in the case of African Americans where there has some obvious historical roots in slavery, but in the case of any demographic group, is somehow metaphysically part of this grand minority group or the non-white people who get on a Zoom call together, then sure, by 2045 or perhaps 2042 or perhaps 2048, America is going to be majority-minority. But to think that somebody who has, one Asian grandparent and 3 European grandparents is somehow naturally a person of color. Or to think that somebody who has European aristocratic ancestors on one side and Indian Brahmin ancestors on the other side and goes to a fancy private school in LA is somehow metaphysically part of the same category as somebody who descends from a family, all of whose members were enslaved violently for centuries, makes no sense. And so I actually don't think that the country in any meaningful sociological sense will be majority-minority. We're going to have an expanding mainstream and hopefully an expanding sense of mutual solidarity. And that's the kind of society we should be building. Because if it is meaningfully majority-minority, if we're going to have these two blocks, then we'll be in a lot of trouble.
Okay. Your question? Oh, we've got a microphone coming to you.
Thank you. This has been fascinating, and I appreciate all of you being here. My question is, you've been studying this is your category, you've been studying this for years. Were you surprised on January 6th? And how surprised were you, and what now?
So I got a lot of emails on January 6th, I was surprised in that I hadn't been following the chat rooms. If I had been following the chat rooms, I would have seen it play out there. This was organized on the chat rooms. I knew that Donald Trump had been tweeting since the previous, in the previous few months about coming to and fighting on that day. But I didn't think it was a bigger movement because I hadn't been following their chats. My overwhelming emotional response on January 6th was relief and gratitude. I know. And it was because if you study, again, you study the years, the months leading up to political violence, you know what to look for. And I have been seeing this in the country. And like Yascha said, I gave a talk based on my book in 2017, and it was a complete bomb. Nobody in the audience believed anything I said. They thought this was hyperbolic. They thought this was alarmist. And it's because if what normal people do is they go about their normal everyday lives. They're not paying attention to what's going on behind the scenes. Everybody I interview who lived through a civil war, whether it was in Sarajevo or Baghdad or Northern Ireland, they all said the same thing. We didn't see it coming. We did not see it coming. We were going to weddings. We were going to work. And then one day the lights went out and we heard machine gun fire. And so what I was so grateful and relieved about on January 6th was how public and how open it was. I was also incredibly grateful that the police response was so weak. Again, that seems counterintuitive, but because there was almost no police response, it meant that you could watch this unfolding in its pure form. You could see who was behind it. You could see who was pushing for it. And had there been a more aggressive police response, that would have been used to create a narrative that there were bad guys on both sides, and that no one was really to blame, when in fact what we were seeing was, for the very first time, this much larger white power movement, which has been growing significantly since 2008, come out in the open in such a clear way that the American public could no longer ignore it.
Yascha, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, very briefly. I wasn't surprised at all that there would be, I don't know how many people it was, 10, 20,000 people who are willing to breach the Capitol, right? And I think that's the wrong thing to focus on, actually. The fact that in a country of 300 million people, there are some extremists who are willing to use violence is actually unsurprising. I think the two surprising things, or the two truly shocking things about January 6th were, one, the weakness of a police response. If you'd had decent security that day, it would have been much less dramatic, and that would have been much better for the country. But two, the fact that these 10, 20,000 people had the support of the outgoing president of the United States, and that president, ex-president, retains control over one of the two major parties in this country, right? So actually, a little bit past like Barbara, I mean, something about the images was clarifying. That wasn't the problem. The problem is the fact that one major political party can currently not be trusted to accept the outcome of the 2024 presidential elections. That's what keeps me up at night, much more than the willingness of a few thousands of people to use violence to get the ends. That we can control. A major political party sabotaging the free and fair elections and the peaceful transition of power is something that we did control in 2020. We might be able to control in 2024, but it poses a serious existential risk to our republic.
Yes, I think that that's something, especially when at the basis it becomes an idea that there is one party that is allowed to win elections, and that the indication of a spoiled election is that that party did not win. But Barbara, Yascha, thank you so much. I think everyone has a lot of questions still. And this has just been so informative, so thank you.
Thank you.